Da 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 da
Snowflakes wafted lazily down in whimsical spirals, adding to the slowly growing white blanket on the ground. From inside the oak cabin, a pale-eyed, dark-haired young woman idly watched the puffy flakes fall to the earth from her plushly cushioned window seat. In silence, Elowen sat, toying mindlessly with her hair, as she stared out into the idyllic landscape of fresh snow and an overcast sky that was sharply cut into the tall trees that surrounded her. The high-pitched whistle of the tea kettle pulled her from her reverie with a startled jump. She put her hand over her heart, sighed, and stood up with a shake of her head. Elowen relished the feeling of her fuzzily socked feet sinking into the ultra-plush carpet she had installed this past summer with a big smile as she walked across the living room floor to the kitchen. Once again, she appreciated the renovations she had done to her new secluded forest getaway. The kitchen had beautifully polished wood floor, and the countertops were black marble. As she approached the stove, a 6-range beast made a black stainless steel. She did a quick twirl on the slick floor. Nearly slipping, she gave a slight scream before catching herself and laughing at her own foolishness before turning off the burner. From a wooden cabinet with glass panes, she retrieved an oversized coffee mug, then reached down to the drawer she had chosen to house her utensils and pulled out a spoon. She grabbed a tea bag from a jar on the counter and poured boiling water into her mug and added her tea, taking a deep breath. She enjoyed these mental tasks in the break from her hectic life in the city. As the tea seeped, she grabbed her sugar jar and dumped 2 heaping spoonfuls into her cup and stirred. Elowen reflected on how peaceful such a simple act was, and how it was almost hypnotic, like watching the snow. She grabbed her mug and returned to her perched window, ready to get lost in her thoughts. Once comfortable, Elowen sipped at her tea, moaning slightly at its pleasant warm taste. She rested her forehead on the glass window, relished the cold of it against her throat, and the heat in the toasty cabin. Falling back into the trance of her snow, she gazed once more at the trees that lined the driveway and outer rim of her new property. She couldn't think of anything more relaxing or peaceful, and she certainly didn't want to return to her job as a finance manager on Tuesday. Enjoying her 4-day weekend, hiding in her cabin in the woods was her only desire. The trees in the woods had an almost eerie look about them, with their twisted and dead gnarled branches reaching hungrily for sunlight hidden behind the clouds. They craved the warmth from the sun like Elowen craved the heat from the fireplace. But unlike the trees, she actually got it, and it warmed her like nothing had ever warmed her before. She mused about the trees, tracing their lines on the glass of her window, when she gasped and jumped for a second time that afternoon. One of the trees had moved, and not like a blowing in the wind. No, it was moving slowly around the other trees. Elowen set down her mug, really focused on the tree line, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. As she stared intensely out the window, trying to make out what it was, frustration was taking over. She couldn't tell what it was, but she thought it looked massive, like a buck. The limbs of the tree weren't actual limbs, but antlers of an animal. That was the only thing that made sense, and as she started, it was only a logical explanation. Abruptly, a long, haunting howl of a scream echoed through the open space between the cabin and the woods, frozen from the icy terror flowing through her veins. Elowen watched as the dark silhouette of the creature fell into the blanket of snow at the forest edge. As quick as she could, Elowen leapt from her seat and ran to the door. She grabbed her fur-lined boots and hastily pulled them over her socks. The old-school snowshoes proved to be a little harder to strap on than she had imagined. and she broke into a cold sweat when another howl came from the fallen creature. Pausing, she looked at the door. She could feel her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. Every fiber of her being told her not to go outside. But Elowen loved animals, and the thought of even one dying alone in the cold like that was too much. She broke out of fear and finished strapping the snowshoes to her feet and plodded to the door. She grabbed a sweater in her coat rack and threw it over her oversized thermal shirt she was wearing. Deciding it wouldn't do well if they both froze to death, Elowen grabbed her pea coat as well and pulled on her mittens. She opened the door and grabbed her snow poles. The snow had covered her tracks from yesterday, and her car was half buried under the soft white flakes. She was glad that she had decided to buy snowshoes. There was no way she would have been able to trek through the knee-high wall of snow without them. Carefully, Elowen made her way from the door up the deep snow, using the poles to keep her balance. Once she got a few feet from the house, she began to move more hastily. Impatiently, she stabbed at the snow, but wasn't careful enough and tripped over a branch as she raised her leg all the way up. She cried out as she tumbled face first deep into the snow. Struggling to push herself up, she began to cry, and the beast returned her cry with one of its own. Once more, Elowen was frozen with a sense of foreboding that came with each wail from the creature, and once more, her need to help the creature overruled. Rolling and curling herself up, she managed to get to the poles. Elowen briefly celebrated her small victory with a hearty laugh. Pushing on through the snow, she went much more slowly and carefully. The sharp pain in her ankle informed her that the fall she took twisted it, and she would have to move it with more calculation. The last thing she wanted was to fall again and not be able to get up. Then, her and the poor animal would both freeze to death in the biting cold. Panting and sweating with effort under many layers, Elowen felt the minutes pass and a rising sense of dread as she inched closer and closer to the buck. She had never been camping or hunting. She didn't know what she could possibly do to help, but that wasn't going to stop her. The creature deserved more than just to die alone in the cold, and she'd held that belief since girlhood. As she treaded closer to the deer, the smell of corruption filled her nose. Gagging, Elowen had stopped on her journey to catch her breath. The scent filled her nose and set on her taste buds. She could taste the putrid flesh and the smell of death emanating off the dying animal. Tears filled her eyes as she struggled to breathe and acclimated herself to the stench. Her heart broke for the animal and its suffering. Wishing she had brought a knife with her to put it out of its misery, she leaned onto the snow poles for support as she openly sobbed for the buck and its suffering. It called out to her, its howl sending shivers down her spine and reminding her not only of the terror threatening to overwhelm her, but her mission to comfort the dying deer. She looked at her pole and decided that she could use it to kill the creature, so her trek continued. Almost upon the deer, she could finally make out its appearance. She had thought she had known terror, but truly she had not. Curled into a ball, she could tell the creature was still massive, and that it was no deer. While it looked like a deer in some aspects, like massive antlers and hood feet, as well as a fur coat, it was also monstrous. The fur covered only its back and shoulders. The rest of its flesh was taut around the bones, giving some sickly skeletal appearance. Elowen couldn't stop looking. The skin somehow looked like leather, but also tar. It looked to be bobbled out pus, the color of midnight, and the smell was hideous. It reeked of death, shit, and rotting flesh. She couldn't see the monster's face, but she could smell the all-too-familiar scent of copper and knew that there was blood on it somewhere. Finally, her body could no longer handle it, and she retched into the snow, polluting the pure white blanket with her breakfast. Disgusted from the bile and the sight of the creature, she turned away from both. Leaning on her snow poles once more, she broke into bodily shaking sobs. The fear she had felt on her walk over had finally been justified, and she couldn't bear looking at the thing anymore. She didn't know what it was. She didn't want to. Elowen looked longingly back at the cabin. She yearned for the warmth of her fireplace and the safety from the horror she was witnessing. Feeling the snot and tears mingling above her mouth, she wiped them away, only to be petrified to stillness once more. She could smell it right next to her, its breathing misting in the air next to her face. The smell was rancid, gagging her again. Its maw was wet with blood. She could smell and feel it brushing against her face. Ever so slowly, she pulled a mitten from her hand and brought it to her cheek. Elowen's hand trembled as she brought her fingertips to her face. Her cheek was warm and sticky. She brought her hand in front of her face to confirm her fears. Blood. The scream caught her throat, was began hyperventilating, her body going into autopilot and her legs pulling themselves from the snow and pushing towards the cabin. Elowen fell hard, only getting a few steps from the horrendous monster that was laughing at her, or at least it sounded like a laugh. It was dry and throaty like a cough, but a laugh nonetheless. Her ankle screamed out in pain, and she knew it was broken. The sobs tore through her as she fought to drag herself to the cabin to safety. She could hear the monster plodding through the snow, lazily, as if it had no worries about her getting away. It frightened her all the more. When it reached down and grabbed her, she cried all the harder and clawed at the snow, trying to pull away. It was too late. The creature flipped her over, and at last she screamed. It pierced the air and echoed off the trees. Birds took to the air, startled by the noise. The monster stared down at her and laughed. Elowen looked into its face, too scared to look away. Its eyes were overly large and milky white. Its mouth, or what was left of it, was protruding sharp teeth, and she could see bits of jawbone. Blood dripped through the holes in its flesh from its teeth. A tongue, black and diseased-looking, hung from its mouth, whose corners were curled into a malevolent grin. The antlers that protruded from its head looked as if they were molting, and it could clearly see that they were actually strips of flesh. The horrors never seemed to stop as Elowen continued to take the monstrous beast's entire form. Its arms were overly elongated and leathery tar, like flesh clung to muscle, and bone like cling wrap. At the end of its arms were razor-like claws, yellowed where they were bloody. She could see ribs through the holes in its rotting flesh and see blackened organs alive, with maggots and flies. The legs were unlike any deer's, but much longer and emaciated from the rest of the body. She could tell that the monster was twice her height as it stood at her feet, and she used its unnaturally long arms to hold itself over her body. Face to face with the creature, Elowen sobbed and closed her eyes. She could not run. She could not hide. This was to be the end of her. She felt the tongue on her neck and face, poking at her eyes, almost insisting that she look. Feeling a glimmer of hope that it was a misunderstood monster who only wanted to be seen, she took one more glance. Pausing, it pushed its face away from hers and looked down. She laughed relief. It didn't want to kill her. What a silly thought. It just wanted help. It was dying. She looked at its eyes once more, smiling. The beast laughed at her again coldly and snarled before sending a final chilling howl to the wind. Elowen knew it had been a trick immediately. It wanted to see her hopeful one last time, wanted to see her face as she knew death was upon her. Before she could get her hands up or plead for her life, its exposed fangs sank into her neck. The breaking of her neck and the laughter of the monster were the last things Elowen ever heard. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Holmes Presents. Today's story was written by Cleocatra, a Northwest Louisiana writer. You can follow her on Twitter, which I've linked here, and I'll also link in the comments. Again, thank you for tuning in, and join us next week for another episode of Holmes Presents. Remember to like and subscribe, and there's a list of links in which you can support the channel below. Happy Saturday.